the one single thing that would stop the threat to everybody, hostages could be released, the shooting could stop, is if the regional powers, the Arab neighbours of Gaza and Israel, were to find a way of putting enough pressure upon the Hamas terrorists to say that the Hamas terrorists need to surrender. They need to give up their fight.
So the US blocked this attempt then. They've called the resolution rushed and imbalanced. Is that your take? Was it rushed and imbalanced?
Well, the proposal to bring a resolution under Article 99 of the United Nations Charter by the Secretary General to draw attention to when he believes there's such an urgent matter that affects international security was the opportunity for this debate to happen. It was inevitable that the United States would veto it because when you're asking for a ceasefire, effectively it's a resolution on a member state. Israel is such a member state of the United Nations, along with 192 others. And around the Security Council table, which has complete responsibility for the peace and security issues, those 15 members you've just described have to decide whether they think a resolution to call upon a member to stop using the guns should be passed. It's then not capable of enforcement, but it's certainly something which has huge persuasive and moral effect. And the thing about such a resolution is it does not and cannot be expected to apply to the terrorists who are also the other side of the guns and the shooting. And so whilst as humanitarians, and I think in this case we're all humanitarians, none of us want to see the loss of life or injuries or the absence of abilities to get humanitarian supplies into what is an extraordinarily pressurized and fearful community in southern Gaza. But you've got to make sure that what you do in the international community is capable of realization. And just passing a resolution which only talks to one side of a conflict is unlikely to be successful. And I think that was the motivation behind the United States vetoing that, and where we as the United Kingdom, in order to stay aligned with the United States, chose to abstain at the same time as I happen to know that the UK is doing a fantastic job, as much as it can, in making sure that supplies of humanitarian aid is getting through as soon as there are opportunities to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting that the sort of what you're saying there about the ins and outs, I suppose, of the resolution, because it didn't condemn Hamas's attack on Israeli civilians in October, which killed more than 1,200 people, and that was a criticism of the resolution that perhaps it wasn't well rounded enough to kind of accommodate all that's required from an organisation like the UN.
Well, this has been the problem, particularly in this area, because the United Nations and Israel have had what can only be described as a pretty tense, even fractious relationship. It is a member state. It is one where a legitimate state that lives behind its borders. It's democratic. It is part of the United Nations system, the highest diplomatic body in the world, and where we all do hope that things, when they go wrong between communities and states around the world, can be resolved by that diplomatic process rather than shooting. The difficulty we have is that when you have non-state actors, as they're called, or terrorists, where they are forsworn as terrorists purely to cause fear in populations, to try and get their aims through illegitimate means, because they know that they can't get them through any other means, that absolutely reprehensible. And you're quite right. If you have a resolution which doesn't mention the war crimes, the atrocities committed by terrorists, if you have no mention of getting the hostages, which is also a war crime by Hamas, which needs to be resolved, and if you have no attempt to try and suggest that there should be a process by which the accountability of those who perpetrated the original crime, it's unlikely to succeed. And so I think everybody around that horseshoe table at the UN yesterday was probably expecting the United States to veto, so it gave them the chance to say that they wanted to see a ceasefire, knowing that it would actually probably not be possible to realise. So that's, to my mind, been a sort of stated case, rather than what you really want is to continue to use the tremendously good offices of Qatar, who've arranged these humanitarian pauses, and to really pursue getting a larger number of these pauses for longer periods of time, so that you can get the aid in, and you can try very hard to protect the civilians who are being abominably abused by the Hamas terrorists, using them as human shields, which makes Israel's attempt to try and rid the area of terrorists all the more difficult and risky.
It's really interesting, Stephen. And I think just to build on a couple of the things you've mentioned there, so the humanitarian situation very much in mind in all of these conversations. I wonder if with a resolution like this, is it as well considered as to say that the UN Secretary General is in some way attempting to demonstrate something of the isolationism of the US and Israel, who are, as this vote kind of demonstrates, certainly in the Security Council context, almost kind of acting by themselves virtually. And so it's about building momentum towards the point at which a ceasefire can no longer be denied or postponed. And so this is just sort of part of the route, part of the trajectory to that point.
Well, I think you put that very well, and it is part of the political aim to try and get that persuasive effect, that sense of inevitability that a ceasefire will have to be achieved, and this is just another step along a very difficult path to get there. I think that's a perfectly valid theory. My experience tells me that it doesn't really hold much water, because the position of the United States in particular, but also we've stayed aligned with that, is that a country must have the right, indeed has the right under every international law, to ensure the security of its own citizens. And a democratically elected state that sits behind borders, such as Israel, has a right to make sure that its citizens are not subject to the threat of terrorists, just as any of us in any country would wish to do, were we so threatened, or indeed as we were ourselves for many years in Northern Ireland, and were pursuing terrorists. And whilst I'm not going to go down that route this morning, we do need to be very careful to recognise that the one single thing that would stop the threat to everybody, hostages could be released, the shooting could stop, is if the regional powers, the Arab neighbours of Gaza and Israel, were to find a way of putting enough pressure upon the Hamas terrorists to say that the Hamas terrorists need to surrender. They need to give up their fight, because that would then remove the reason why there is this shooting. And that's where it seems to me that in order to maintain regional stability, there needs to be a much greater acceptance that, rather than forcing this sort of isolationism, as you put it, of the United States in supporting Israel, there should be a recognition that, albeit it's a very large majority of states, the Arab states versus a single state of Israel, they should come together to try and prevent the threat to Israel, and accept that Israel is a state. It's one which the international community has absolutely set up and ensured exists over the last 70 plus years, and we need to make sure that we stand behind that commitment.
Stephen, it's really fascinating getting your insight. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Stephen O'Brien, former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, with his analysis based on his experience of working at the UN as to what this kind of ceasefire resolution and indeed the veto by the US actually means.